everyone. This is James Green with the Resilience Think Tank, and today I'm very excited to be with my friend Ray Holloman. Ray, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I have uh, been in this industry doing this for a little bit. I live in Middle Tennessee. I always like to tell people I have a farm. So when I'm not doing resiliency work, I'm outside. I have chickens, turkeys, and a duck on top of all of the garden work that I do. So right now it's the late time of the year, but yeah, I just enjoy being outside. Uh, spend a lot of time trying to give back to the community. So spend a lot of time trying to just educate people on the things that I'm passionate about, and then ensuring that our future generations have some experiences that I didn't have growing up in high school and college to see maybe somebody that looks like them in IT, because that was one of the things that I really didn't see growing up was people that looked like me in IT. So I didn't really know how to navigate the space. And so I don't want people coming up after me having to have those same experiences.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that first stood out about you when I met you. A lot of people talk about where's the next generation of resilience professionals? Where are the young people? What should we do? Let's write a blog post that no one reads or a white paper. And you are very active in your community and in the schools, like connecting with people, which I love because it's so important to get people into the profession. And so I'd love to hear from you. How did you end up in our profession?
Yeah, so I thought, coming out of high school, like I knew computer science. I was like, oh, I'm gonna go into computer science. Got into college and realized that the computer science program I was in was very math heavy, and I am not a math person. And so I switched over to the business school and went into information systems management. And through that, I've started learning a little bit more about information security. And so I was like, okay, when I graduated undergrad, I was like, oh, I'm gonna go get a school here in Tennessee was starting up a master's in information security. And I was like, oh, I'll go do that because I've got a really big interest. The job pipeline was growing. And that's how I found out about business continuity and disaster recovery. It was actually a class that I took out of the 12 classes in my program. I think it was like class number 10, but like
Okay.
from our intro class that we had at the beginning, that really intrigued me because I was working on a service desk at this time, and I just saw how our business got disrupted every time we had to evacuate our building. So you've got 200 service desk agents. If you have to shut down that entire building, you have to think about how are you going to continue to take calls if everybody needs to work from home now and they cannot work in the building. And I'd been in this job a couple of years, and every time we sent people home, we sent them home differently.
Okay.
Teams did things differently. Nothing was consistent. One team would send the person that lived the furthest away from the building home first. Well, we had people that drove in from like Huntsville, Alabama. That was 2 hours away from us.
Oh
So if you
wow.
sent them home first, that meant you had to wait 2.5 hours maybe before that person got back online, before you would send the person that maybe lived 15 minutes down the road. And so just thinking through, how do we start doing that? So I ended up doing my master's capstone on redoing our business continuity plans. So I redid our plans for the entire department. And so my presentation, I presented it to my professors. I had them come to my office and I presented it to
Oh
all of the
wow.
leadership in my organization, and my professors came in. And through that process, I got connected with our disaster recovery people because I was trying to learn about like what are some of the corporate policies, what were other things that were in place. Like I started looking into like what's our phone system redundancy, what's our service, our ticketing service, what's that redundancy. And so I graduated, and then I stayed in contact with the guy who was over the disaster recovery department. About 6 months after I graduated, he had an open position. I applied for it, and he hired me. And so I was 24 years old, had spent the last 4 years on a service desk. And so that's how I got into the profession, was just that I had this want to really understand, like, how do we recover our systems? How do we get them back up? I was working for a healthcare company, so knowing that our systems, if they have downtime, could mean, you know, a missed medication, a provider may not see a person's allergy, just that importance of it. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And then just learning more continually of, like, how do we make these things better? How do we think about people that, may not understand, uh, like, now I work for a global company. Now I got to think about, not everybody reads and write in English the same way I do. So why would I put a plan in English if Spanish or another language is the primary language that they speak? So thinking about those things. So yeah, I just got into it because I decided to go to school for information security and saw a problem that I could solve, and have stayed here because it's continuously new problems that come up that I have to find new and different ways to try to solve.
That's fantastic. So you and I, we serve on a couple of different boards and committees together. And one of the things I really appreciate about you as a speaker is every time I see you speak, Ray, the topic is completely different. So you're not giving the same talk track for the next 30 years. I know that. And even from conference to conference, it changes. So with that, I'd really be curious if you could share with us, like, how do you view the resilience profession today? And I'd love some thoughts from you on your place in our profession.
Yeah, I think that even in the time that I've been here, I've just seen it change so much, our profession. Like, I know when I first started going to conferences, you would have the same type of things. I feel like two things that have really impacted our industry a lot is obviously the pandemic. I mean, a lot of people have been planning for that for years. And so now we see, like, all these plans that we've had now came to fruition. But I think the other thing that we've really seen is the rise of cyber and just how that has impacted. And so, how we have to think about, especially being in IT disaster recovery, I have to think about that differently.
Yeah.
I can't just say that, oh, I have a backup and I can use this backup. That doesn't work. I have to think about, okay, is this backup good? Was the bad actor in that backup? Do I need to go further back? And so I feel like my place in it is really just trying to constantly push people to think about things differently. I think a lot of people get stuck in, well, this is the way that we've always done it. But I was like, the bad actors do not care about the ways that we've always done backups. They don't care about the ways that we've done these things. They are thinking about new and novel ways to try to impact our processes. So we have to kind of get ahead of that. And so I like really coming to conferences and bringing topics of things that, like, I'm either struggling with or trying to figure out, like, hey, what are other people doing in this space, and trying to have a conversation around that, because that way we can start seeing, okay, where, like, if I'm having this problem, a lot of times what I've seen is other people are having the same thing. Nothing is in a silo. And so it's like, okay, what have you done as your company to solve this? This is what I've done. I'm not saying this is the best way or the worst way. It is a way. And so getting that feedback from people to say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. And so then being able to take that forward and being able to share that with other people and say, hey, here's what I heard from somebody else over here, that this is what they did to solve their, air gap process. We use this. You may be using another solution, because we all are in drastically different companies, like finance and healthcare. They're regulated. They're going to have their stuff really tightened up, versus somebody that may be like a manufacturer or a retailer. It's going to be different. But I think we're even seeing now that even in the retail space, we're starting to see more of that resilience and continuity mindset come in. I can't remember what company, but somebody just hired, like, their first chief information security officer, because they're trying to take on people stealing stuff from the stores, and so shoplifting. And so they're trying to think, is that ways that they can do that through IT? And so it's like that kind of continuous process improvement, that's where I really see it, like just continuing to push people to be like, let's think about this a little bit differently. And so I think people kind of enjoy that. And I enjoy it myself because that way I'm not talking about the same thing every time. And it makes forces me to go and look for something else to talk about.
Yeah, your insights are so powerful on that. When you mentioned to me last week in another call, like, hey, are you looking at RTO versus RTO when you have ransomware? That was a light bulb moment. Like I just started, that had never crossed my mind that if we're the victim of ransomware, the RTO is not wholly dependent on the IT department. And that's things like that are so powerful. You mentioned a couple of times conferences and meeting people at conferences. So let's talk about a subject. You shared with me you're not going to be attending any conferences in Florida for the upcoming year. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you know, your thoughts on that and maybe what you would want our audience to know when it comes to issues that are now being controlled by, jurisdictions or governments.
Yeah, so I am not attending DRJ Spring or anything in Florida for the foreseeable future, a lot because like as a transgender person, that it's not a safe place for me to go. Like I do a lot of education and advocacy here where I live and kind of across the country. And just knowing that, they have created laws to kind of harm the community that I'm a part of. We have seen all of these organizations come out against saying it is not safe for queer people, people of the LGBT community, especially transgender people, to come to the state of Florida. Seeing all of the people that I know in Florida that are trans and seeing a lot of them leave because they don't feel safe and they don't feel protected, not feeling unsafe, like potentially going into a public bathroom somewhere. It's like I've got to think about my own health and safety and just the additional stress that that creates on me to try to attend a conference. Like I love going to conferences and meeting people, but it's not worth, with my safety. And like I understand that conferences are a big thing to move. And so, but for me, I've made the decision for me personally not to attend. And I think that we saw some of the similar backlash happen with North Carolina a few years ago. A lot of people pulled out of their state when they passed a very similar bathroom bill. We're seeing the same thing happen where entities are not allowing their employees to travel to the state of Florida because, like, we care about the health and safety of our employees. We're not going to put potentially anyone at risk. And so that makes it hard when you have a jurisdiction kind of making these rules, but the people who truly get impacted are the people that, people that rely on the tourist dollars, the people, the conference communities, all of this, because there may be certain subsections of people that do not feel comfortable or are not allowed to go. And so it's like that makes it harder to keep that continued connection with, people that you usually see maybe once or twice a year at these conferences. But at the end of the day, a lot of people were coming up to me at the fall conference and saying that, hey, for their own personal reasons, they have a very similar stance of like, it may be because the NAACP was like, hey, it's not safe to travel to Florida. A lot of people, which I think sucks because there are a lot of great people in Florida. And, it's like, but the government has now made it in a way it's like you haven't made it safe for other people to feel like they can come there. So it's a very interesting place to live and sit at this time. And so I hate that I'm going to miss the conference, but I've got to think about my own safety and well-being first and foremost.
Absolutely. We all in our profession talk about life safety is always the first and foremost goal of any business continuity or resilience program. So let me ask you, how can people in our profession or people like myself be a better ally for you, or what are ways that we can support so that our colleagues feel safe at a conference or traveling?
Yeah, I think that some of this is, as we start looking for new places, I feel like in some ways we're still coming out of the pandemic. It's like starting to think about where are states that, as we started looking for new conference venues, looking at states that have protections for the trans community, for the LGBTQ community, looking at those places and trying to highlight those places first to say like, hey, we have this commitment to DE&I, so we are going to be looking at moving to say states that are safer for our entire community in subsequent years, and then just ensuring that if you know of somebody that's not attending the conference, still like reaching out, connecting, figuring out, hey, is there 30, you may have chatted for 30 minutes on the floor at a conference. Maybe if you're at the conference or right after, you're like, hey, I didn't see you at the conference. Wanted to still connect and just catch up with you because we catch up like 2 or 3 times a year. So really just making those connection points, because it can feel sometimes isolating maybe if you don't go to this conference, like, oh, you're going to feel like you're missing out on all of this good information and all this networking. So still trying to make those points of figuring out ways to connect with people, either before or after a conference. Say, hey, I know you didn't attend, just want to catch up, because that way still getting that networking time, and then obviously having, options for people to virtually attend if they, because sometimes there's so much great information that is shared. So being able to attend and still get that information and follow up with the speakers like you would have if you were just at the conference.
Yeah, those are all some great ideas, and I appreciate you sharing them. You're one of the most forward-thinking people in our profession that I know. So I'd love to hear from you. What do you see as the future of resilience?
Yeah, I see that. I feel like for so long, we've tried to do planning in this way of like, oh, our RTO, we kind of mentioned it earlier. Our RTOs are covering all scenarios. I don't think that's gonna work anymore.
Yeah.
Especially as we start seeing cyber attacks and just the expectations that we give to, our organizations, to our business holders, our stakeholders. Yeah, it's great if I can say that I can get you back up in 4 hours if it's for, a crash server or, a weather event and I need to move our operations. But what if a bad actor's been in our system for 90 days? We may have to rebuild that entire system
Yeah.
because we don't have a clean copy. That may take a week, 2 weeks. What are the things that we have in place there? Does the business understand that we have to now think about, getting more into, like, I won't say scenario, like individual scenario based planning, but big bucket planning. So like, what do we do if we have like this type of a mutable event? Are these different buckets that we see, and do we set up different RTOs, different downtime procedures, practices that we do to ensure that we can keep the organization running long term? That's where I think that we're going to really start seeing this shift, because we get in IT, we get held to these RTOs that we state, and it's like, yes, if we have these perfect conditions, I can get you back up in this time frame. But what if I don't have these perfect conditions? What if the system goes half down and we end up corrupting ourselves, and it takes us 36 hours to fix it versus the 8 hours that we stated? But that's not a scenario that we had typically planned for, because we're thinking, oh, we're just going to go clean down, everything will go offline. Well, if that doesn't happen, then the scenario has changed. And so it's starting to get into some of these parts and pieces. And I think we're starting to see that a lot with like the microservices in the cloud, where it may just be easier to just redeploy somewhere else than rebuild.
Yep.
So I think we're just going to continue to see this evolution of like, what does, especially in IT, what does our disaster recovery need to look like? Does that need to change based upon the scenarios that we have in these big buckets? Like, I don't want to go to plan for, okay, how do we respond to a hurricane versus a tornado versus, strong winds? But maybe I have a severe weather event. Maybe I have a power event. Maybe I have a ransomware event, because they all may have different responses based upon, do we have a generator? Do we not? Can people access our building? Do we want them to shelter in place? Having these big bucket type things. So you're like, maybe it's 5 scenarios that you're planning for versus just one. But you're not planning for 25, 30. You're not planning for every individual one. You're putting it into a bucket and being able to pull that plan out.
Yeah, that's so interesting because a lot of our colleagues, including myself, use an all hazards approach. So we don't care why we're down. We just know we're down. But to your point, it assumes we can start recovering and rebuilding immediately. There's now these threat actors or ransomware. If I still don't have my servers or my databases or my data, I can't start rebuilding immediately. So there's some huge underlying assumptions there that are probably going to have to change. That's really interesting. Last question we have for you, Ray. So if people want to connect with you or learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I always tell people connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a message and say, hey, I heard you talk somewhere. I love talking to people and just chatting because I feel like that's where I get the most, like, I learn the most is from talking to other people. Or you can send me an email at ray@hollomansolutions.com. I will respond back. And just because I think we've got to stay connected because, like, what I see where I sit at may be a different experience than somebody sitting in another field. So, like, where can I learn from you? Where can you learn from me? And just kind of keeping that conversation going because I think that's the important piece because I wouldn't have thought about this, RTO type scenario unless it was a conversation that I was having with someone else and I was like, wait, we are hurting ourselves by setting up our RTOs this way because the business has this expectation and we need to separate that expectation out for them of, these two big buckets of events. A regular IT disaster, I'll call it, and then maybe a cyber event where there's some more investigation that needs to go on. But I love to connect to people, talk with people, chat about anything IT disaster recovery. I also will chat about my chickens and my farm if you want to know more about that as well.
I'm going to follow up with you on that, definitely. Ray, we want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And for our audience, if you like this interview, you can find all of our content on our website, resilienceThinkTank.com.